morning, everyone. I'm Christina Osborne with the ISO Stakeholder Engagement Team, and I'd like to welcome you to the second working group meeting related to the native load and available transfer capability calculation topics as part of Phase 2 of the Transmission Service and Market Scheduling Priorities Initiative. As you recall, this initiative was formerly called the External Load Forward Scheduling Rights Priorities Initiative, but we recently updated it to give it a more intuitive name that better represents the issues that are being addressed in the initiative. So the ISO is planning to issue a notice later today announcing this change. So first, Milos Bosanik from ISO's Market Policy and Performance Team is going to kick off the meeting, and then he'll turn it over to Eric Schellenberg and Trevor Schultz from Idaho Power to talk about available transfer capability within their area. We do have several other working group members and ISO representatives who are on the line. They're listed as panelists. I'm not going to introduce all of them, but they are listed there. So these are the meetings we have coming up. We had a meeting this last week on the 10th, and then we have two others on the 19th and 30th. We are planning to schedule additional meetings, but on the 19th, Salt River Project is going to share their practices, and then VPA will be sharing their practices on the 30th. So there will be opportunities for other stakeholders to present their ideas and perspectives as well. So if you are interested, we are planning to schedule some additional working group meetings in December. Just let us know, and we will make sure that we dedicate some time on the agenda during those meetings. And so all of this, we did post the presentations. You know, ISO's presentation that we posted really is just more the agenda and just reminders about the upcoming meetings. But we did post Idaho's presentation earlier today. So just remember to go to the webpage with the new name to get the materials. And of course, we are recording the meeting, and we will post the video file out on the initial webpage once we receive it from the vendor. And just as a reminder, before reprinting any related transcriptions, to please contact the ISO first. There will be an opportunity to ask questions during the session, and I'll provide instructions for how to raise your hand at that time. We're going to start with questions from the working group members and others who are on the speaker line, and then we'll open it up to the rest of the stakeholders. These working group discussions are intended to foster open dialogue, sharing of ideas and perspectives, and overall brainstorming on the different topics in the subgroup. These discussions may not be representations of official company perspectives and should not be treated as such in order to foster open dialogue and idea sharing. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn the meeting over to Milos Bosanik.
Thank you, Christina, and good morning, everybody, and thanks for joining us for the second working group meeting. As you may recall, last week we discussed some of the logistics. We reminded you some of those here in the last couple of slides about upcoming meetings. But last week you also heard from Arnie from Vistra. They provided an overview of some of the FERC guidance regarding native load priority and helped us really ground us in the common terms that we'll be hearing about throughout these few working group sessions that are coming up as different entities are sharing their practices. Today we're going to hear from Idaho Power and their practices when it comes to calculating available transfer capability, or ATC, as well as calculation of native load needs and different components of the ATC methodology. And we really appreciate them making themselves available, taking the time to put the materials together and taking time out of their busy schedules to present. We really look forward to the discussion. I appreciate the Idaho team making themselves available. We may ask questions throughout the presentation. This is for Eric and Trevor. We may ask questions throughout the presentation, both the ISO team, some of the other core team members, or stakeholders at large. Will be opening it up for questions at different periods. But if there are any questions that you're not able to answer or not comfortable answering, as it may go into a certain level of detail that you're not comfortable sharing, or that may in some way be asking for certain sensitive information, please feel free to defer those questions. I also wanted to reiterate, as Christina noted in the introduction, these meetings are really intended to be collaborative discussions, brainstorming session, fostering dialogue. So we encourage you all to ask questions if there are any. And then today's presentation is intended really to be, again, an overview of Idaho Power's practices based on their interpretations of the different FERC orders and NERC standards. and this forum should not really be used to question the validity of those processes. They're simply and graciously sharing their practices, what they do today, in order to help us at the CAISO and all the entities that are participating in this forum and in the initiative, to help us really identify different practices and help inform what we may be able to do when calculating native load needs and ATC across the ISO system. So we really, again, appreciate the Idaho team making themselves available. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Eric and Trevor, and your presentation. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. This is Eric Schellenberg from Idaho Power. Trevor Schultz and I worked on developing this PowerPoint presentation. We are both in the system planning group here at Idaho Power. Yeah, absolutely wanted this to be more of a conversation. Tried to keep the slide deck from being, too massive, and so we can maybe facilitate a good back and forth. So let's get into it. All right. So our ATC algorithms come right out of the NERC standard mod 29-2A. There are basically two, one for firm, that's the subscript F, and we have the non-firm or subscript NF. And so I kind of wanted to start with this. It gives you the kind of generic high-level view of where we're going to go throughout this presentation. And so we'll kind of dive into each of these little pieces and parts as we go, but this is kind of where we're heading. So on the next slide, you'll see some of the definitions. So we have obviously ATC, or that's what we're all here to talk about, available transfer capability, total transfer capability, TTC, ETC is our existing commitments, CBM is our capacity benefit margin, TRM is the transmission reliability margin, postbacks are adjustments to the ATC due to the annulment of a reservation. Counter schedules, also called counter flows, is energy scheduled in the opposite direction for which ATC is being calculated. And I will say that from the mod 29 standard with respect to counter flows, it is left to the transmission service provider to determine and specify how those are used in their ATC ID, which is posted on our OASIS site. So TTC, this is kind of the start of our flow process here. We have the path studies to determine a path rating. We have the transmission provider's contractual rights on the path. And then from there, the TC is calculated as the smaller of either the path rating, the operating transfer capability, or the contractual rights. And so the path rating process, we can go to the next slide, sorry. The path rating process is really governed by WEC, which is the Western Electric Coordinating Council, and it promotes the bulk electric system reliability for the area in blue there. WEC is the regional entity that's responsible for compliance monitoring and enforcement. So the NERC standards that we're referencing are oftentimes enforced by WEC. Next slide. Okay, so now we get into the path studies, and they're basically a project coordination, a path rating process, and progress reports. Previous, can we go back just a little? Yep, just want to touch on these a little bit. So project coordination is really a way to inform the broader community that there is an opportunity to participate in a review of a project, and it's a way to solicit participation in the project, and it's also intended to avoid any duplication of projects and allow for a new project to integrate the needs of other WEC members. And then the path rating process, this is known as the three-phase process. You can see there's actually four, but phase two is broken up into two pieces. So we call it a three-phase process. And this is really where their project and get participation, as well as talk about or address any potential impacts to other projects. And I'll talk a little bit more about these. Progress reports are required throughout the entire process. It's just, you know, you start with the draft, and then as you work your way through the path rating process, the report becomes, you know, more and more final. And so those are required as part of it. Next slide. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about that three-phase process. There's an initiation process, study and emphasis, and mitigation, and those are in all of the phases. So in phase one, the initiation is that you've sent out your project announcement, and that goes to either the data collection process or it's a letter sent to the RAC or STS. And when I say RAC, that's the Reliability Assessment Committee in WEC. And underneath the RAC is the STS, which is the study subcommittee. It's really the STS that sort of governs and kind of shepherds the whole process. In that initiation for phase one, you, as the entity, have proposed a rating. You have independent studies and a draft of the comprehensive project report. That's the study part of phase one. At this point, other projects are not obligated to recognize your project in their studies. So that's phase one. As you move through the phases, that's going to change. So as we go to phase 2A, you'll have a comprehensive progress report that's accepted. That establishes the planned rating. The sponsor of the project forms a PRG, which you can see down there as a project review group, and develops a rating study plan and appropriate system-based cases. And so at that point, other entities are participating and providing input and kind of steering what that study needs to include and what makes sense to study. And so that's kind of one of the focuses of the PRG. Projects in phase 2A will include all phase 2B projects and phase 3 projects in their studies. For phase 2B, the study plan and foundational base cases are accepted by the PRG. So now at this point, you know, the sponsor has solicited input, has developed a plan, and as well as a power flow cases and contingencies and everything else that needs to be studied that's been agreed upon as part of this process. This establishes basically similar situated projects that must be studied. So in the study emphasis phase of 2B, the rating studies demonstrate both non-simultaneous and simultaneous ratings with simultaneous projects. So you're looking at projects that would be affected and as well as interactions between your sponsored project and theirs. If there are interactions concurrent phase 2B projects, those will be identified, and the burden of the study rests on the project that's entering the 2B phase. Mitigation requirements kick in at phase 2B. So projects concurrently in phase 2B are equally responsible to mitigate impacts, if any, on other phase 2B projects or paths associated with projects that have an existing or an accepted rating. And then we move into the final phase, which is phase 3. So we start over again with initiation. This is kind of the permitting and construction phase, the RAC at this point, and this has established the accepted rating of the project. And then we move into the study emphasis, which is just really the monitoring of the progress and final determination of all the identified mitigation measures, excuse me. In the study considerations, other projects must treat this project as an existing, provided it continues to meet its various milestones, construction milestones, mitigation milestones. Other projects that are, and then as far as mitigation in this phase 3, other projects that are not similarly situated or in phase 3 are responsible to mitigate their impacts on this project, provided it continues to meet the milestones. Mitigation requirements, if any, must have been determined and resolved before the commercial operation date of the project. The path rating process overall is deemed complete when the project enters commercial operation. And we go to the next slide.
Sure.
So are there any, let's just stop for a minute, and are there any questions so far on the WEC path rating process or how that works?
Yeah, so what we'll do is we'll first take questions from the work group and other panelists. So if you could raise your hand if you are a panelist, go ahead and raise your hand. So, and then you just need to unmute yourself. So let's start there, and then we can open it to the rest of the stakeholder participants. And you can raise your hand. There's a little hand icon above the chat window, so just go ahead and click on that. Okay, I don't see any questions from panelists, so let's go ahead and open it up to the rest of the stakeholder working group. So again, you can select the little hand icon, or if you're just dialed into the meeting, press #2 on your phone. All right, I don't think there are any questions, Eric. You want to keep going?
Perfect, I'm getting off easy, I like it. Okay, so base cases, these are the primary tools that we in planning use to determine the path rating throughout this process. There's various power flow softwares that can be used. PowerWorld, GE, PSLF, and Siemens seem to be the 3 most popular, at least that we deal with. So during the process of compiling each base case, WEC staff as well as functional entities that are participating in that base case compilation, and Idaho Power is one of the entities that participates in the development of these base cases. We all follow the data requirements and procedures outlined in the WEC data preparation manual. And these base cases, again, are going to be sort of the foundational starting point for which we take them further when we look at our path ratings. So what WEC will do is they will issue sort of a quick little document that basically says this is what we're looking for in this particular base case. And so they're typically seasonal. So it could be, we want a case that represents WEC for heavy summer or light winter, that kind of thing. And then the functional entities support that effort. So diving into that a little bit, generation and load levels that are referred to in these case descriptions refer to the season being studied. And so, for example, if I had a case description sheet for a winter-based case that called for high hydro, that means high levels of hydro generation for a winter condition. So it doesn't mean necessarily that I have high hydro as a mean. So in some areas, high hydro generation in the winter may be less than the median hydro in the spring or summer. So that's what it means when they call for these, high generation or high load, but they need to be seasonally adjusted. Light loads may be increased in importing areas. Heavy loads may be decreased in exporting areas. And that's really to represent the desired interchange schedules that are in the case. Renewable generation, typically when it's specified, it should be based on the individual entity's renewable portfolio standard. Specific information on the desired load levels is contained in the base case description sheets. So that can be used as a guide when we're preparing our cases. And then all loads are coincident unless indicated otherwise. Interchange schedules in the base case description sheets refer to that target flow that should be reached to represent the anticipated flow levels and direction for the season being studied. And then targets are altered as anticipated operating conditions become more clearly known. So the net schedule over an interconnection or a transfer path within a transmission operator areas shall not exceed the TTC. So that's regardless of prevailing actual power flow on the interconnection or transfer path. And no elements within the interconnection shall be scheduled above continuous operating limits. The interconnected power system will remain stable upon loss of any one single element without system cascading. And following an outage and before adjustments can be made, no remaining element shall exceed its short-term emergency rating, and the steady state system voltages shall be within emergency limits. And that's kind of what goes, that's a high level condensed version of what goes into base cases. And again, those are our starting points that we use when we go into a path rating process, and then based on input from others, we might tweak those a little bit. And that input could be, oh, hey, I have a remedial action scheme here that's going to impact that kind of thing. And so those base cases are then fine tuned and then agreed upon and form the basis for how we develop our path ratings. Next slide. So here's where we've been. There's the flow chart. You can see that we have now identified the TTC on our paths through the WEC path rating process. And that's the first blue item there in our firm and non-firm equations. Next slide. So now we need to determine TRM, CBM, and ETC, and that's based on reliability needs, customer requests, and existing commitments. Next slide. So existing transmission commitments. I won't read the slide to you. You can see it there, but we have basically firm and non-firm, and we do have equations for ETC that are dependent on the time horizon. So scheduling horizon, operating horizon, planning horizon. The firm native load is capacity that's set aside to serve our peak native load forecast commitments for the time period being calculated. The NITS is the capacity reserved for network integration transmission service serving load. The Idaho Power OAT requires native and network load and resource forecast to be submitted annually. So for native load, any forecasted deficit for a given month is assumed to be covered by off-system purchases. Firm transmission capacity is set aside on various import paths based on the forecasted needs, and if a resource has not been designated to utilize the set-aside transmission capacity at least 30 days in advance, the transmission capacity is released. The native load forecast utilizes a 1 in 20-year peak load forecast and critical water hydro capacity forecast, which helps us account for uncertainty. Planned generator outages are also considered in the forecast. Grandfathered is the firm capacity set aside for grandfathered transmission service and contracts for energy and or transmission service executed prior to the effective date of our OAT. PTP is point-to-point. Rollover rights is the firm capacity reserved for the rollover rights for contracts, granting transmission customers the right of first refusal to take or continue to take transmission service when the transmission customer's transmission service contract expires or is eligible for renewal. And then other reservations, I skipped that one and went to the rollover rights. That's the firm capacity reserved for any other service, contract, or agreement not covered in any of the above. So that's kind of the catch-all. And I guess this is kind of a lot on this slide. So I'll pause here and see if anybody has any questions on this one.
Great, thank you. Let's start with the panelists. I do see, Milos, you have your hand raised, so go to you first.
All right. Thank you, Eric. Really appreciate it for you going through this. Maybe I've got several questions, and maybe that gives a little bit of time for others to jump in and ask other questions if they have any. But I think this is really the meat of where I think we want to learn particularly more about this existing transmission commitments and how you derive and calculate native load needs. I also do have a question about the TTC component, and maybe we can circle back to that. But let's start with questions on native load and ETC calculation. So you noted that you use a particular load forecast. I think I missed it, but you utilize a particular load forecast that I think is a little bit more conservative that ultimately helps you account for uncertainty. And this load forecast is, maybe you can give us a little bit more sense if this is the load forecast for both native load and network integration transmission service, and then if you could just repeat the type of load forecast that you utilize.
Yeah, this is Trevor Schultz. I'll step in to see what I can do to help answer some of these questions. Let's see. So first, for native load, we said it was a 1 in 20 year or 95th percentile peak load forecast. For the network loads, not native loads, we don't specify a forecast, and we leave it to the load serving entity to use what they want. I think I'll just leave it at that.
Okay. And this load forecast, the 1 in 20 year peak load forecast, I think that's a fairly conservative load forecast. I'm assuming that's utilized in the long-term time frame. Do you update that forecast as you get closer in time and are deriving, for example, short-term ATC? Or not sure if we're going to get to that as well, but is this the singular load forecast that you utilize throughout your ATC calculation, and particularly for native load determinations?
It's excuse me. It's a monthly. One number per month. So there's 12 peak loads that are forecast, and then we update that every year. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I guess do you always utilize the 1 in 20 year forecast when deriving those native loads, or do you adjust those forecasts as you get closer in time and are deriving shorter term ATC or ETC calculations, or are you just always using the 1 in 20 year forecast? That's my main question. Are there any changes to that load forecast at some point in time as you're calculating native load needs, or is it just always using the 1 in 20?
Gotcha. I'm not really familiar enough with the details as we get closer to real time to be able to answer the question.
Okay.
Trevor, this is Kathy.
Yeah.
So Milos, we don't really necessarily change the load forecast once it's kind of set, but what each entity does, they can only schedule as much transmission as they have load. That's all they have the rights to. And so that's where that releasing of the set aside comes in, the 30 days out that Eric had mentioned. So if, for instance, they're getting closer to, June and they're seeing, they really don't have a critical water year, then they just will not designate any resources to match that set aside because they're not deficient. And that will then, calculate, it will release out into the market as firm transmission. And that's kind of how we manage that rather than continually updating the load forecasts. So we manage it that way as the load serving entities and native load customers get closer to the horizon. They recognize what their needs are. Also, if they want to start doing off-system sales, right, they have to start undesignating resources. So if they end up being long, they have to undesignate resources to make those off-system sales, which then also releases the transmission that's been set aside for native load. So there's various different mechanisms under the tariff that achieve that kind of update without formally going in and touching the loads.
No, appreciate it. Thank you, Kathy, for that. And I've got one more question, and then we can turn it over to others that may have questions, and then we can circle back to me because I've got a couple of others. But I'll just ask one more for now, and others can jump in as well. So I think, Eric, you noted as well that when you're calculating those native load needs and you're making certain generation assumptions, if there's any kind of a deficit in terms of, you're using a conservative 1 in 20 year peak forecast, and if there's not enough designated resources, I'm assuming that's what you meant, there's not designated resources to meet that forecasted load, you're assuming then that the rest of the generation that is going to be serving that load is coming from off-system purchases. So you would, in your scenarios or in your base cases, you would increase the off-system purchases or imports to serve that 1 in 20 year load. Did I hear you? Is that a correct interpretation of what you noted, that if there's a deficit in terms of you don't have enough designated resources or other resources that you've assumed that are serving that 1 in 20 year conservative load forecast, you're making an assumption there that then the rest of the generation that will be used to serve that load is coming in from imports. And you're reserving, through that calculation, then you're reserving transmission capacity for those off-system purchases or imports that are serving that load.
Yeah, forecasted deficits for the given month are assumed to be covered by off-system. Yep.
Okay, got it. Thank you. Okay, Christina, I think we can open it up to others. I've got some additional questions, but I think we can open it up for others as well.
Yeah, no problem. And I do see Kathleen has her hand raised, so we'll go ahead and go to Kathleen's question, and then we'll open it up to the rest of the participants. So go ahead, Kathleen.
Great, thank you. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. Thanks to Idaho, to Eric and Trevor and Kathy. This is really interesting. Just wanted to dig into some of the details as well. So I think my first question that I have is kind of trying to differentiate the native load versus the network integration transmission service and what we've been talking about, what I've been hearing. I'm assuming that for your network integration transmission service, that is being set aside for the network customers based on this forecast. And then when the LSCs don't designate or do not designate up to a certain amount, you mentioned it got released. I was wondering if you could clarify that that is separate from your native load approach, and or if it's not, if it's on the same forecast, but how the initial basis for setting those two set-asides differ in approach. If you could talk about that in a little bit more detail first. That's my first question.
Yeah,
you got it?
Well, I was just I'm probably gonna pass this one over to you eventually, Kathy. But just the sequence of where we talked about native. The releasing of the capacity 30 days in advance applies to the native load, and then I guess Kathy, could you help answer how things work for the other network integration transmission service reservations?
Yes. Yeah. So they provide us a forecast. We do a reasonable check on it. We don't, insist that it's a 1 in 20 or anything like that. And then pretty much the internal network customers we actually have, for the majority, serve their load off system. So we then go to the Interties, grant them the capacity they need. They actually have designated resources already to tie to those loads. And so they've already got those established. If they do have a deficit, we do ask them, how do they plan on serving that? And we will grant them, import capability also that they need to then go and designate. They don't have the same 30-day because, again, they have long-term designations attached to a fairly stable load. But the native load is where, it's the 1 in 20, and that's where we've really imposed the stronger restrictions of, you've got to go get this physical resource and designate it, or that transmission is gone, and you don't have firm transmission on the Idaho power system to serve this load. And so it's kind of that way. Hopefully that answered kind of the question.
No, absolutely. No, that absolutely did, Kathy. Thank you. So I just circling up, make sure I'm under that for the network customers, mostly long-term contracts that have already been committed, and so they've previously designated the network resources, which are fairly static. Yes. I am hearing that the native load forecast, you're basically saying, okay, you need to go out and get additional resources and designate these as network resources to maintain this set aside. Is that an accurate recap of what you said?
Correct. Yeah, we are a summer peaking utility. Just to kind of give some perspective. And so, there's only certain times of the season that we really need to go and procure purchases. And so that's why, they don't go and make out, they make long-term purchase for everything that they need, year round. But if it's, 1 month out of the summer, they don't necessarily go do that until it gets closer to the time horizon that they recognize they need it or not. So, yeah.
No, that's really helpful. And I mentioned a couple times the network resource. I did, if you don't mind, just confirming my understanding that what is designated does have to fit kind of the standard network resource sufficiently firm construct.
Correct.
Is that correct?
Yeah,
Okay.
so those off-system resources that they are designating, they have to be firm from the point of title transfer. So if you've purchased a Mid-C purchase and you're taking title of the energy at Mid-C, from Mid-C to Idaho Power's border, you've got to obtain that firm transmission in order to use the firm network on our side of the system. So those long-term network customers have procured long-term rights to get to our borders and have designated those resources under the standard designation process outlined in the tariff.
Great, that's really, really helpful. I'm just trying to think through the timing as well, going from a longer term to the scheduling horizon. Is it fair to take away then that from kind of the timing perspective, the NITS is pretty static? The native load may fluctuate from the planning horizon to the scheduling horizon, but for the firm and non-firm calculations that I see here, I should kind of think of is it largely the same amount of ATC in practice between the firm and non-firm and you may be getting into this level of detail, but I'm trying to track the inputs from the firm ETC in the scheduling horizon to the non-firm and see what's changing. And maybe that's an error question, but can you track that for me?
It's probably a question for me. So,
okay, is there? Okay, there's a lot of formulas.
Yeah, you're good.
I'm a formula, so apologies for being like, can you help me?
No, you're fine. It's a lot of letters there. So basically, so just like our network customers like our native load customers, our network customers actually are profiled monthly as well. And so anything they don't schedule, so they have their NITS firm, right? If they don't schedule it, it becomes non-firm, just like a point-to-point firm reservation. So if we have set aside, they said they have a peak load of 400 megawatts, and we set aside 400 megawatts, and that day it's a little cooler. So they don't have 400 megawatts of load, they have 300. That extra 100 will get released non-firm out into the market because they didn't schedule it. It doesn't actually go firm because again, we're not doing dynamic updates of the load numbers. We're just putting that in as a non-firm availability. Now, if they decide they wanted to undesignate it because they don't need it, then of course it would release into firm. But generally, the network customers, don't tend to do that. The loads are, not thousands of megawatts. So, but that's the difference between the kind of the firm and non-firm, and then also, in the NITS, non-firm is also secondary network usage. So if somebody, went and bought secondary network usage, 6NN, that would decrement from the non-firm.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Kathleen. And I don't see any other questions from the panelists, so let's go to Alba. Thanks for your patience, Alba. I know you've had your hand raised up some time.
Yes, I'll just unmute their line. You'll hear a beep tone when your line is unmuted. After that, you can go ahead and ask your question. Your line has been unmuted.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, Alba.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Wonderful to have this level of detail. I'm going back to a little bit more basic question on this slide, are the NL, the native load forecasts, are those by participant, or is there an aggregate?
Yeah, Idaho only has one native load customer, so
Okay.
it would be by participant in this case.
Right.
I don't know what others do, quite honestly. If you look at the native load forecast that's out there, it's Idaho Power's.
Okay. So you're both the calculator and the source of this in this particular case. But
so we have different areas of the company.
Okay.
We have a separate transmission function employee group.
Okay.
And then we have a load serving group. And so the load serving group, along with our load forecasting folks, take care of the forecast. They send it to the transmission service provider group, who then implements their rights.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And then is that that number is obviously quite critical to ultimately what gets made available. Is that number published in any way before or after the fact?
I believe it's on Oasis. Trevor, is that correct?
Yes, that's my understanding.
Great, thank you. And it's one peak number per month is what is used in this calculation.
Trevor, that's correct, right?
Yeah, and the calculation to determine the amount of set-asides, yes, for native load, yep.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the clarification. That's all I had.
Thanks, Alva. Looks like Tyrone raised his hand. So Tyrone, you just need to unmute yourself.
Thank you so much. Can you all hear me first?
Can hear you.
Excellent, excellent. Good morning, everyone. This is a really helpful portion of the presentation. My question is related to the 1 in 20 load forecast. The first part is whether or not if there's a NERC standard that specifies that should be the guidance. And if not, or if there is not, can you explain maybe just a little bit more as to why you selected 1 in 20?
I'm not aware of a NERC standard that dictates what forecast is used. And as far as background on why that particular level of forecast was chosen, Kathy, can you help with that? I know it's a pretty typical forecast that's been used in planning purposes for a long time as far as I've been around in the company. But Kathy, anything to add?
Yeah, you know what? I don't have anything to add because I will tell you it was before my time that was kind of established as our standard of usage. And so I think it's just the one that we felt was probably, the right one for our situation and how we sit given our predominantly large hydro system.
Mm-hmm.
So I can't really point to that, sorry.
Okay, all right. Well then that's helpful. The other question that comes to mind as you mentioned that, is that 1 in 20, do you intend for that to also include load growth? My understanding is the native load calculation also includes some form of losses in load growth. So when you say 1 in 20, is that baked in there or assumed to be a part of that?
It is assumed that when they give us their load forecast, that they have taken care of load growth issues. So we're not building anything on the transmission provider side for their load growth. The transmission customer, either native load or network load is basically supposed to cover that in whatever forecast they're giving us.
Okay. And then I think I might have misheard you, so I'm totally learning on this, so I appreciate your patience. But I think I heard someone mention that there are some instances where you'll spot, I'm using my own language, but you in essence will spot check what someone has provided and may make adjustments. We do
a reasonable test more than a spot check, right? So we'll take a look at their load and do a reasonable test. So if somebody's got like a load of 300 megawatts and they all of a sudden for next year, they submit a peak load of 1,000 megawatts, we might go, wait, what's driving that? Is that right? And we'll kind of just do a reasonable test so that we're not, so customers, either native load or network customers, are not inflating their load forecasts.
Okay.
To the point of kind of unreasonableness, right? And that just comes down to that open access principle. If you have these, crazy forecasts that are holding out all this capacity that aren't even, you know, what I would consider reasonable based on where their load is currently at, then, you know, you're just holding out capacity and taking it off the open access market, and that's probably not the best thing to be doing. So it's a reasonable check. It's more like, again, we'll just ask them, we'll be like, is this growth? Where do you see this growth at? So.
Gotcha. Is that like within, do you have like a percent amount, like a 5, you know, something varies by 5% based on a monthly historical or annual historical, or is there another number that you're kind of just using for that reasonable test?
I don't know that there's a percentage number. Trevor, do you look at anything as a, you know, particular? I mean, I think people by now are so used to us, you know, they don't really do that anymore. But Tyler or Trevor, when the network customer sends you his forecast, is there a percentage, or do you just kind of make sure that it appears in line with what they historically or growth ways might have?
Yeah, no, there's no particular number. I just typically compare it with last year's forecast and look for changes. And if there's anomalies, I ask questions and we figure things out. If there were errors, and if there weren't errors, then typically the percent, you know, change is not really very high.
Yeah, and another reason why we need to kind of know that is also if they have a large load that they're all of a sudden projecting, you know, we want to know where that's at on the system, because maybe the local system can't handle it, and they need to go through, you know, a whole nother process for transmission upgrades and things like that to accommodate it. So that's another reason why we also kind of look at it from that perspective.
Super helpful. This is really, really helpful for me. And then maybe just one last thing, and just as a comment, this is going back to some of the earlier slides, just showing my own proficiency. I couldn't find the raise hand button, so I apologize for that. But as you were talking about the total transfer capability, I think the process you described, which I think was helpful as it relates to the accepted three-phase rating process. But the other part is also taking into mind that there's the existing existing ratings that don't go through that same three-phase rating process. And I'm sure you're all aware of it, but I just wanted to maybe note for the audience, that existing ratings don't go through that same process. Thank you.
Thanks, Tyrone.
Yep.
All right. So I don't see any other hands raised. So Milos, do you have some additional questions?
Yes, I do. No, and again, thank you, Kathy, and thanks everybody for answering the questions. So going back then just a little bit more on the load forecast component, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, Kathy and others, but sounds like, you know, the 1 in 20 forecast is that you receive, you know, from your merchant function for native load in particular, and from your network integration customers. Those are 10-year forecasts. It's not just an annual forecast, but you're getting multiple years in that forecast, and therefore they're able to account for load growth across different time frames. Is that right?
Trevor?
Yeah, for the set aside process for native load, it's a short-term forecast. It's not 10 years. It's a 2-year forecast.
Okay, 2 years. And therefore they're able to then account for load growth across those time frames.
But I think, Trevor, they're giving us a 10-year forecast per the ode, aren't they?
For network customers, they're giving us a longer-term forecast, and I believe it's either 10 or 20 years. I think it's I can't remember. I think it's 20 years.
Okay. No, it's good to know. It's just that it's over some kind of a time frame that they're able to. It's not a month-to-month thing, but they give you, you know, whether it's 2 years or 10 years, they give you some kind of a longer time frame forecast that's based on this 1 in 20 conservativeness level that can account for that load growth across that different time frame. So in terms of then, now switching just a little bit to the generation assumptions, so, you know, I think we noted that you're then using designated network resources to assume that those are serving that 1 in 20 year forecast. If there's a deficit, you would make certain assumptions that remainder of the load is being served by off-system purchases or imports. Is there a particular how do you determine which off-system or imports are serving that load? You know, I'm not too familiar with Idaho's system. I assume you have probably multiple points of injection. Is there a particular distribution that you account for when assuming, you know, a certain amount of imports are serving that load across different tie points? Is there a particular methodology? You know, let's say there's a deficit of 1,000 megawatts for roundness. You're assuming that's being served by imports. Are you looking at how do you distribute that across different tie points? Is there a particular methodology, or, you know, do you just evenly distribute it across? If you have 3 different injection points in your system, you're assuming 300 megawatts of imports are coming from across each one of those points.
Yeah. So I'll start, and Trevor can correct me since he actually looks at this. So we start with our network customer who has very defined points of receipt to our system. So we fill up those for that network customer and make sure those are full. Also, you know, we do have some rights along some of those as well. So we kind of fill those. We look to the west first because that's where the Mid-Sea market is. If you think about where Idaho is situated, and there's about 4 different tie points that you can import into Idaho from that Mid-Sea market area. So we tend to start there. And again, we let the network customer who has very defined points have theirs, those first. For the native load, then they have a preference on where they like to come in at based on where they have firm transmission rights already. So we try to accommodate those. Firm rights on the other side of the tie, right? So if they have some firm rights on a Vista system, we'll try to match those set-asides up to the Vista system because they already have that transmission purchased. So we'll do that. So it's kind of some conversations also with that customer of, hey, you have this deficiency, what's your plan? And where's your preference of imports? Because it also could be on the east side of the system in times as well. So we do try to, you know, work with the customer initially on where's your rights at that you're planning on utilizing. Yeah, because we don't want to go stick some import on some place where they don't have any transmission rights on the other side, or there's not able to get transmission rights on the other side to be able to designate the resource because it doesn't do any good. We do have a constrained path on the western side of our system. For those that are familiar with the WEC path ratings, path 14 is the Idaho Northwest path. And so we can only import so much from that Mid-Sea market across that path. So that does limit it as well.
No, thank you. I appreciate it. Sounds like then there are some conversations that ultimately inform and likely it's, you know, where historically they've gone or, you know, where they have those transmission rights. So, yeah, appreciate that. Thank you. Another question, and I think, Eric, you mentioned this, but just wanted to make sure I captured it right in my notes. You talked about that planned generator outages are considered in the forecast, and I think that's what I captured, but wanted to see where those planned generator outages are captured. Are they captured in the generation assumptions ultimately that you're using to serve that 1 in 20-year forecast? Are you saying that you're accounting for planned generator outages within those generation assumptions? So maybe you have different scenarios or have some way of accounting for those, for the uncertainty associated with generator outages that may materialize?
Yeah, this is Trevor. I'll handle that one. It's typically the planned generator outages are happening in months where you don't need generation, and all these assumptions come from, you know, the load serving side of the house. And you know, sometimes there are, you know, I guess planned generator outages. Maybe something fails and has you know, it's out for a year. Then, you know, that gets included in the forecast. We need to know about that. And does that help answer the question?
Yeah, and just to confirm, what forecast are you referring to? It's included somehow in the load forecast?
Yeah, the native load when I say native load forecast, I guess what I mean is really a native load and resource forecast.
Okay. Good.
Full load and resource forecast. Yep.
Okay. Is there any other uncertainty that's accounted for? I presume because you're using, you know, the 1 in 20 conservative load forecast that that's accounting for a certain level of uncertainty regarding load. Are you explicitly also accounting for any kind of load forecast error as well, somewhere within the methodology? I don't know if it's within, the ETC component or elsewhere, but are you accounting for that type of uncertainty as well?
No.
And that's largely because of you feel that the type of forecast that's already utilized is already conservative enough that there's not a need to necessarily account for explicitly for load forecast error.
Correct.
Okay. Okay, I'll pause here and yield the floor to others as well.
Great. Looks like Kathleen has her hand up again. So go to Kathleen.
Great, thank you. Really appreciate this. I have a few more questions. So you just tacked another one on when you mentioned that the native load was load and resource forecast, which just triggered in my brain. So am I understanding you correctly then that when we look at these formulas, the native load is incremental, so it's just the deficiency that you identify that's set aside on top of the NITs? Is that kind of how I should be understanding that?
It's the scheduling rights basically associated with that path to take a resource to load. So if there's a resource that is, so for instance, for Idaho Power, we have Bridger generation that's on the east side of our system. So if you look at our path 19, which is our Bridger transmission path, if you looked at the ETC in that, you would see scheduling rights to move that generation to load equal to the amount of their designated network resource or equal to the amount that they said they needed for that load. So it's really tied to the rights to transfer that generation to that specific load that's in that calculation. Because load is a big number, right? Load is 4,000 megawatts. And in that 4,000 megawatts, how are you going to serve it? Well, there's various different generators that are coming across various different places. And each of those intertie points into Idaho has its own ATC calculation. Does that make sense?
I think so. I think what I heard you say, just to do a 3-point, what I think I heard you say is that for the native load and firm input, it is the forecasted native load need that is associated with some kind of firm scheduling, right?
Yeah. So, the load is kind of throughout Idaho, and there's 6 different ways to get into Idaho, plus a bunch of internal generation. And so it's really matching each generation to kind of the load needs, load areas. So it really becomes important on the interties, right? Internal to the system is just redispatch if you become, a problem. But the interties is where it really becomes an issue from an ATC perspective. So it's whatever generation is going to cross that intertie or that cut plane where the calculation is occurring to meet load. So if there's 100 megawatts on one side of the cut plane to meet load, then 100 megawatts of scheduling rights from that network resource to load are in the NL, in the ETC. It's really path specific.
Great, no, that's really helpful. And so a few other questions that I had, just to confirm. So I'm curious if when you have the grandfathered portion that is in these calculations, I assume that was, done kind of similarly to others where there was a chance when you kind of set up the framework for new firm applications, and was curious if you know if it was done through a lottery or like how you went about giving that opportunity to get the grandfathered at the time of the framework.
Yeah, so we're fortunate. We have actually eliminated all of our grandfathered agreements, but we did have them. And what those were pre-OAT agreements. So as they expired, people had to move to the OAT service. So we just then moved into some form of OAT service that gave them kind of a close to equal right of what they had. Remember, we're not in the in CAISO, right? So everything is physical rights. So if they had 200 megawatts from move to here under their grandfather agreement, we converted them to OAT rights, and they have those same kind of rights. And then we terminated the grandfather agreements at FERC.
Great.
And we don't have any anymore.
That's really helpful. On the point-to-point portions, do you allow for any point-to-point prior to that T-minus 30 time period? I'm just kind of curious if, okay, cool.
Yes, we sell long-term firm point-to-point. We sell conditional firm point-to-point, which is also a long-term product. We actually do have customers who have conditional firm across our system. We sell monthly, weekly, daily firm. And then in the non-firm, we sell monthly, weekly, daily, and hourly. So we do sell long-term firm point-to-point when it's, if it's available on the system.
Great, super helpful. And I think my last question is, if you could just, I missed what the other reservations is. Is that secondary network or is that something else?
Other reservations, it's kind of the NERC catch-all. I'm not even sure if we have anything in OS, to be honest. I think it's just part of the calculation in case people out there had something that maybe fit in, this weird world or something.
Awesome, thank you. Appreciate it.
We don't really have any that I can think of except for, that might be in our calculation. It might be where we hold out an ownership of somebody else. So, on the AMPS line, for instance, Idaho's, owns so much and PAC and Northwestern owns so much. We might use OS in the calculation so we don't sell into their share, but I'm not really sure.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I see Jeff Nelson has his hand raised. So Jeff, we'll go to you. Just go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, good morning. Thank you very much. It's Jeff Nelson, SCE. I just got they're little 101 questions. Could you articulate what the difference is between conditional firm, and non-firm?
Sure. So when we start with the TCC, there's only so much that we can sell. And we sell it firm first, which is the highest of the priority. If somebody can have it all hours of the day on a firm basis, then we consider that firm, right? However, there are situations in our system where the long-term firm, so you can't have it all year long because there's some system condition or some more hours where we can't give it to you firm because there's either a prior commitment on it or something. And so that's conditional. I guess I wonder,
so is he, and I'm sorry, I had to jump onto a
Sorry, we're going to background noise for reminders.
I like the idea that
I can hear some background noise, so if you can please mute your line.
And it's there,
Maybe mute that person.
The issue is it's really complicated to have it count for the local. If it's not also a system resource.
Yes, I just muted their line.
Okay,
great.
Sorry, I was like, I'm hearing people talk. Okay, sorry, Jeff. So
it's conditional is like if it's not available 24/7, 8760 for some reason, but there's certain hours are excluded, then it's conditional firm.
Correct. Yeah, it's still a long-term firm product. It's still considered a yearly firm product. It's just that they are subject to a lower priority, which is equal to secondary network, which is basically the highest of the non-firm product during those times where they are considered conditional. So for Idaho, for instance, we've sold some conditional firm products where we didn't have the firm ATC in the summer to tell them, yes, you can have this service firm. And so they are conditional in the summertime, subject to curtailment. If everybody of the firm usage came and used all their rights, they would have to get off the path.
Okay, and so how does that compare with non-firm?
So non-firm, for Idaho, we have a monthly, the highest that you can buy is monthly. That's the longest you can get is a monthly. So there's no long-term non-firm on the system. We don't sell it in that way. Non-firm also, you can only buy, I think 60 days before the start of the service. So there's time parameters on how soon you can really buy it. Non-firm is just that, right? You only have this right because somebody else isn't really using it, or, you know, there's counterflows that are allowing you to use it. But you are the first to go off the system should curtailments be needed. And within the non-firm bucket, you know, there's different priorities. There's the monthly, weekly, daily, and hourly. And so each of those have a different priority of curtailment order. But basically, you know, when we have to curtail, we start at the lowest of the non-firm and start to work our way up. And when we get to the firm, everyone within the firm bucket, whether it's native load, network load, point-to-point firm, gets curtailed on a pro rata basis. There is no concept of gonna, you know, cut everybody else and keep my load. It's pro rata. So everyone coming import on that path, if we get into firm curtailments, everyone that's got a firm reservation gets a cut.
Okay, that's helpful. Then I had a question about the network service. It wasn't clear to me how the requests work and what they need to do to verify the requests. And it wasn't clear to me what they pay. And it wasn't clear to me what happens if they make a request and the network can't support it. So could you talk through some of those issues?
Yeah, so there's an entire application process in the OAT that outlines network service. And so basically what they'll do is if they have a load in our area that they want service for from network, they'll go follow that process and say, you know, here's my network load. Then they've got to go tell us the resource, and they designate the resource. And then we do a study to see, you know, the feasibility of serving that match. If we can serve it, they sign a service agreement that gets filed at FERC, and they have network service. As far as how it gets paid for, they pay a load ratio share of the system for that service. So, you know, there's so much in transmission investments that have to be paid for, and they pay their load ratio share at the time of the peak for that.
So, but you said if you can support it. So
yeah, so like let's say they pick a resource that is behind some constraints.
Right, exactly. Right.
We can't get it there. Then they get, then we have to tell them what we can do to get it there, whether it be a build or, you know, something to be able to get it there. And then we work with the customer to determine how that works, what that's going to look like.
So what happens if, well, so if you did have to build something that otherwise you weren't going to build, do they have to pay for the entire build?
Oh, that's a really good question. I would think, so the way we've interpreted it is if it's a network upgrade that, so this is just for network customers, right? If it's a network upgrade that benefits all network and native load customers, then it tends to fall into the transmission investments, and everyone pays kind of their share of it. However, I think, and going out in front of my skis a little bit, I think if it's like specific to them, like if there is a single feeder that only serves them, right, then we can direct assign it. But for the most part, a lot of it just becomes socialized into the bigger system because they're not the only customer benefiting from that upgrade.
And just following through on this sort of, so if you originally did a study and I, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, but Idaho's load's been growing a lot, and a lot of load.
Yeah.
If you originally did a study and this network customer, you could support them, everything was good, but then your load starts really growing and you can no longer support the network customer and your native load, what happens? Do they ever
that's where the planning process hopefully has worked. And my friends Eric and Trevor have done their jobs using the 10-year forecast that people are giving them and recognizing that we need more import capability or we need more whatever in an area, and have used the transmission planning process to start doing those upgrades. It's a big reason why, you know, we have B2H, for instance, which is a transmission line that we're trying to get built. for import capability for load and network load service reasons. So that kind of falls into the planning process, and the IRPs and all of that.
But they don't get kicked off of their service. Their service isn't conditional.
No. Yeah, I think that's a big point too to note is that, unlike the point-to-point world, which has a conditional firm service, there's no such thing in the network world. If you give them network service and you grant them from a designated network resource to a designated network load, that is firm. Now they can go get it from an economy purchase and not designate that resource, and that can be non-firm, and that's okay. But if we said, yes, you can have this network resource designated to this network load, that is firm transmission, and there is not a concept of conditional firm. That's only a point-to-point.
And just one last question. What's the duration of this network service? Do you offer multiple durations? 1 month?
Yeah, it's whatever the customer wants. Some customers elect to do it every 5 years and just keep rolling it over. We have one customer that has 20 years, and when those 20 years start to come up, then they roll it for another 20.
Okay.
So there's no set duration.
Okay. It just, it's just something that the ISO, these concepts don't really don't exist in the ISO. Okay. Thank you. That's all I had. Thanks very much.
Kathleen still has her hand raised. I don't know. Kathleen, did you have additional questions, or did you just forget to lower your hand? Oh, okay, great, thank you. And I know Milos has another question.
All right, and I promise this is the last one, but I think this is helpful to tease out some of these issues for not only the ISO, but for the broader audience as well. And then we can, I think, move on to the next few slides. But just wanted to go back then to just putting this into the context of the ATC methodology, what we talked about here, the calculation of existing transmission commitments. One of the components of ultimately deriving the available transfer capability that can be reserved by others after you've accounted for your native load needs and your other existing transmission commitments. One of the components of that assessment is what you, Eric, I think talked about earlier, is the total transfer capability across a particular path or a flow gate. And this ATC methodology, it's calculated, I think, on a path-by-path or flow gate basis. But for the TTC component, I just had a question. If you know that there are transmission outages across a particular path that you're calculating or flow gate that you're calculating TTC or total transfer capability, if you know that outage in advance, and let's say you know a month in advance that there's an outage there that significantly reduces the total transfer capability across that path, do you account for that ultimately in your ATC as well? Meaning that, you run your study with that lower TTC amount if you know of that outage well in advance.
Yeah. Go ahead, Eric.
Go ahead, Trevor. Well, I was just going to say we do account for that that lowered TTC in our ATC, and I'll let Trevor expound on it.
Oh, yeah, the short answer is yes. If there's a transmission outage, we'll reduce the TTC for that path for the duration of the outage. That gets posted out on OASIS when that outage planning process occurs.
Mm-hmm. And that would obviously then, to the extent that you reduce that TTC, that would obviously then reduce the amount of ATC that you may have available to sell to others, assuming you've accounted for all the other components of the methodology.
Correct. And yeah, when we plan outages, of course, if we know it's coming, we try to plan it during obviously the less impactful seasons. And obviously there's nothing we can do about unplanned outages.
Yeah, and so and that leads me then to that question of unplanned outages. You don't make any certain assumptions when you're calculating TTC about unplanned outages. It's just if it happens, you've sold the ATC. It may lead to certain curtailments, but you're not necessarily accounting for some uncertainty in your TTC calculation ahead of time if you don't know of a planned outage.
Correct.
Okay, that's all I had. I think if there are no more questions, Christina, I think we can move on to the next one.
I think there's one more from Chris Devon.
Yeah. Correct, yeah. Let's go to Chris first, and then we'll move on after that.
Okay, you'll hear a beep tone before I unmute, when I unmute your line. So after that, you can go ahead and ask your question. Your line has been unmuted.
Hi, can you hear me?
Hi, Chris.
Yeah, hi, this is Chris Devin with Customized Energy Solutions. Just curious a little bit more to understand perhaps a bit about like the process for doing a request from either, a load customer or maybe a developer that's looking to, do some transmission service type of request. And if you guys have like an open season or some type of process in this whole study process for the ATC and transmission service requests, if you have could you maybe help explain that? Is there like a specific part of the process, like when you were looking at those past studies earlier in the slides when you're talking about that, or some other process where there's like an open season where you can actually request additional service and then that gets incorporated into these projects and make sure that we have enough robust transmission to do serve all the needs that are requested. Is that clear?
Yeah, that's clear. So Idaho Power does not have an open season concept. We go based on each request, and you can put a request in at any time. And so unlike, Bonneville and maybe some of the others that might, and they'll talk to their own practices, and I'm not even sure what they do. We don't have that open season concept. You can put in a point-to-point request at any time and have a study. You can put in a new large load request at any time, and we'll do a study. And so it's just looked on case-by-case, request-by-request basis.
Okay.
Yeah, we have I was going to point out we have a business practice posted that discusses kind of how that works. If there's big chunky loads coming online, it discusses the network and native load. Kind of just study processes for how that's handled. I think it's business practice 2. I can't recall for sure, but it's out there.
Thanks,
business practice 2. I'll take a look. Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate the clarification. That's all I have.
Milos, did you have another comment? Sorry.
No, I think we can. Well, actually, let me just note. I know a couple of questions arose regarding the planning processes and the processes for reserving transmission. I'll just note that we will have, and we're in the process of scheduling the additional 2 working groups that will get into more detail on what's the process for requesting and ultimately reserving transmission, how do they do the evaluations for the transmission service request, as well as working group 3, which will focus on the planning process aspects and pursuing upgrades. I know a couple of questions arose in here, but it's okay. I think they were high level enough. But keep in mind there will be additional working groups that we're in the process of scheduling that will get much more into detail and learning about other transmission provider practices on both the transmission expansion side as well as the process for reserving and requesting that transmission service that we'll need to learn about.
Great. I don't see any other questions, so I think it's okay to move on to. I'm going to go ahead and move to the next slide, Eric.
Yep, that sounds good. Thank you. Okay, so the next 2 slides, first one is TRM. The next one after this is going to be CBM. We use TRM at Idaho Power. That's the transmission reliability margin. NERC Mod 8 was developed to promote consistent and reliable calculations and kind of provides the framework for what people include in TRM. At Idaho Power, our value of TRM varies by month, and it's approximately 200 to 325 megawatts, and it's primarily driven by adverse loop flow or unscheduled flow, which is recalculated and updated every 6 months. There are other things that can be included in TRM that we don't per the NERC mod standard. We assign our TRM to our western paths in the west to east import direction. And Kathy mentioned a little bit, on the west side of Idaho Power, we have multiple connections to the northwest, which gives us access to that Mid-C market. The TRM amounts are path specific. And it is offered as a non-firm ATC on a path unless there's system conditions that prohibit its use on a non-firm basis. And then we'll go to the next slide and talk about CBM, and then we'll just take a quick pause and see if there's any questions about our use of TRM and CBM. So capacity benefit margin, again, there's a NERC standard. This one's mod 4, and its intent is basically the same as mod 8 for TRM, and that's just to promote some consistent and reliable calculation methodologies. CBM is firm transmission capability that's preserved to enable access to generation from the interconnected system to meet generation reliability requirements. So the preservation of CBM basically allows the load serving entity to reduce its installed generating capacity below which might otherwise be necessary because we have this ability, this CBM. It's offered non-firm on paths where it's allocated. And again, our CBM is allocated on our western paths in the west to east import direction for the same reasons that TRM are. And we base our CBM on the most severe single contingency. It's only intended to be used in times of emergency generation deficiencies. So it can be used 60 minutes after the loss of a resource occurs, only after Idaho Power's load serving entity is experiencing a declared energy emergency alert 2 or higher. And I'll just pause for a minute and see if there's any questions about how we're using TRM or CBM.
Okay, we'll start with questions from the working group members and other panelists. Milosh, I see your hand raised, but let's see if anybody puts their hand up. So looks like we have a few questions, excuse me. So let's start with Kathleen, and then we'll go to Jeff.
Great, thank you. This is Kathleen from Vistra. I think I heard you say that for TRM that you do release it for non-firm reservations in the ATC calculation. My recollection is that's different than the pro forma OAT that would retain the TRM even through non-firm. Can you explain a little bit the rationale why you feel comfortable releasing that up for non-firm purposes, or clarify if I misunderstood too? Thank you.
Kathy?
For some reason I was thinking it was the TRM that you are kind of required to release on non-firm, and it's the CBM that you aren't, but it could be reversed. Basically, because ours is based on a loop flow calculation. If we're not seeing that high loop flow going on, then there's not a reason to not maximize that system and let people use it on a non-firm basis, keeping in mind that if for some reason that unscheduled flow does come up, we will curtail the non-firm schedules because, again, those are non-firm. So that it's really just maximizing the system to its greatest benefit.
No, that's really helpful. Yeah, I've always tried to make sense of why CBM gets released as well. When the contingency happens, you can curtail. So your explanation helps me very much so, because that's my my hallmark that I use for the CBM.
Yeah,
so thanks.
Yeah. Some people maybe don't do their TRM because, if it's some kind of weird system condition that really just doesn't allow them to do it or something, maybe that might be why they do it. But because ours is loop flow based, it really is just because if the severe flows show up, we'll just start curtailing.
Makes perfect sense. Thank you.
Okay, we'll go to Jeff next.
So again, these are real 101 questions. So sorry for doing it. It's the capacity benefit margin. I thought I heard you say that you reserved based on a single largest contingency. Did I hear that correctly?
That's correct.
So let's just say that whatever, I don't know what your biggest unit is. Let's say you have a 1,000 megawatt unit. I don't know if you do, but let's just say. So how does that 1,000 megawatts, if that's your single largest contingency, let's assume it is, so I can work with numbers and kind of get my mind around this. How do you spread that 1,000 megawatts around? Do you put it all on one line? Do you put a couple hundred on each line? Do you do it pro rata? Do I even have the concept right that you're going to reserve some capacity on the line that you're not going to sell firm as a result of CBM?
So no, you have the concept correct. And what we do, so ours happens to be 330 megawatts, and we hold it out on the Idaho Northwest path, which is our path to Mid-Sea Market. That's how we do it. That's a big market hub. So if we were in an energy emergency, and our Northwest Power Pool, couldn't perform any longer or some bizarre reason, we have the ability through that to go get 330 megawatts from the Mid-Sea Market and get it into our balancing authority. And again, any load serving entity in the BA can utilize that. It's, when the BA, if we're short, the BA is just deficient. So it's determined in our case, Jeff, by getting to the Mid-Sea Market and across the Idaho Northwest path.
This is great. This is helpful for me to just get my mind around what's going on. But you say, okay, so how that impacts is that whatever you said, 330 is just not available for long-term firm sales on that path. Is that right?
Correct.
Now, when you said it's available for any load in your grid, if there's an emergency, does that include like network customers?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not specific to native load. It's per the Mod 4 standards. So the Mod 4 standards, the NERC standards outline when and how you can use it. And then we have a business practice that tells somebody specifically like how to go use it if they needed to. And so it's if a network customer in our balancing authority needed to use it, and so did Idaho Power native load, we would follow our business practice. I can't remember what it says. It might be a first come, first request, but I can't remember. But regardless, we're going to make sure, we get load served up to that 330.
But your system has to be in like I forget, just something of stage 2, but you have a different name for it.
Yeah, Energy Emergency Alert 2. Yep, EEA 2 or higher.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. Thank you again. Just 101. Appreciate it.
Yep, no problem.
Thanks, Jeff. So Milos, before I go to you, I'm going to check to see if any of the participants have any questions. Again, you can select the hand icon above the chat window, or if you just dialed in, press #2. Just give it a moment. Shreyas, no questions on the phone?
I do not see any questions on the phone line, and there are no questions on the WebEx queue as well.
Great, thank you. Milos, do you have some questions?
I do. So on the TRM, going back to the TRM topic, just to make sure I understand, are you accounting for any, under your current practice, are you accounting for any type of uncertainty within the TRM margin as it comes to serving native loads or network loads? Any uncertainty accounted for in TRM?
No, our TRM is strictly based on a loop flow methodology. But I don't know, Trevor, does the standard, I think, outlines some of the things that you can do with TRM. We don't account for that. We take a historical view of unscheduled flow on the path and update the numbers based on that.
Okay, and then on the CBM front, it sounds like, obviously, I think that's consistent with the NERC standard. The NERC standard, I think, dictates that you use the CBM in an EEA2. Is there a point in time where you release the CBM potentially as ATC if it's not going to be utilized?
So it's always released and sold non-firm.
Mm-hmm.
For us. I don't know if that's a requirement. I seem to vaguely recall maybe you don't have to release your CBM non-firm. It could be reversed. But we do actually, in our non-firm calculation, we do not hold out CBM in our non-firm calculation. So we will sell it non-firm.
Okay. So and what that practically then means is, even though you will release, and correct me if I'm wrong, even though you will release it as non-firm transmission, if ultimately the need to use it in real time arises, you will still deliver those 330 megawatts of imports that you reserved from transmission, or the CBM for. It's just that it may lead to curtailments of non-firm transactions to decrease the flows enough to allow for 330 megawatts of additional imports. Is
Correct.
that how it would work?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. I think that's all I had on this. Appreciate it.
Okay, it doesn't look like we have any other questions, so turn it back to you, Eric.
Okay. Okay, so this is kind of the flow chart that we've been looking at, built out a little bit more. This is available in Idaho Power's OAT rather. And so this is kind of where we're at. We've calculated TTC, TRM, CBM, and ETC, and then that's entered into the WebTrans system for each season. WebTrans posts those values into Oasis. The E-tags are fed in, and it sweeps the TSRs, and then all of that is then out and available on Oasis. And so there's kind of the final ATC equations again. And I think we've talked a lot about TTC, ETC, CBM, TRM. Just briefly again, touch on the postbacks, recalls, redirects, resells, annulments. Non-firm postbacks include firm postbacks plus the unscheduled capacity of firm ETC. And then if counterflows are just energy scheduled to flow in the opposite direction for which ATC is being calculated. At Idaho Power, we do not use counterflows to calculate firm ATC. We do use firm counterflows in the non-firm ATC calculation, and that's just a little bit more of a conservative approach. And so that's really the last slide. If we go to the next slide, that's just sort of a recap of everything.
Eric,
yep.
Sorry, this is Trevor. Can we go? I just want to point one thing out on the last slide there.
You bet.
Under the ATC non-firm calculation at the bottom, you do see, the CBM and TRM terms appear, and we just got done telling you that we don't include those when determining ATC. The little subscript S and U they mean something special. That just means if we actually are using CBM, then of course it is included. Or if for some reason in real time we're actually using TRM, then that gets included as well. So just wanted to point that out. Those really typically aren't in the formula.
Thanks, Trevor. Yep. So that ends the slide deck. So I guess we can open it up for any other questions, anything that anyone wants to talk about.
Yeah, it looks like Kathleen has her hand raised again. So go ahead, Kathleen, and then I see Milos has his hand up as well.
Great, yeah, if you go back to the last slide. It's really helpful. I think, it's an interesting kind of the back and forth on do you release CBM or not? Do you release TRM or not? The orders themselves, just to clarify, because I know I've heard a couple, the general idea is that TRM is retained, but that's, I believe, under the pro forma, but that's generally done because if it's something that's systemic, right? Like if it's you're trying to account for modeling errors or et cetera, and so then you retain it through the non-firm. Your explanation made sense for why you may not do that, but then your last statement about you might include it if you expected the loop flows to occur also makes perfect sense. But I just wanted to clarify that on the CBM, generally in the pro forma, it is set to 0 for non-firm purposes on that premise that you can curtail it. So it's appropriate to open it up, make the transmission system more available for more optimal use. I was curious, in any OAT you can ask for adjustments to include that CBM, which seems like you have based on your implementation. Can you shed a little light on the rationale for why you would want to continue to reserve CBM through non-firm, and how you would make that judgment call and what that rationale is? Thanks.
And thank you for the clarification on those. I always get them like which one's required and which one's not, because since we release them both. Yeah, we release them both, so I'm like, I don't know. I think it's really just transmission service provider specific, and everybody's systems are just so different and unique. I think for us, we have a business practice that tells somebody how to go out and even use the CBM. So we don't really have a great need to not release it out there. we're part of the Northwest Power Pool as well. And so we have, another area we can go to if we get an energy emergency situation. So we've never really, we talk about CBM internally periodically about, well, do we keep it? Do we not keep it? Do we, what do we do? We've always elected to keep it because of the mid-sea market issue. But we've just always never really not considered releasing it. So I don't know. I don't know if people would keep it or not. And TRM, again, is such a system specific, right? If you've got, like you said, some systematic reason where, gosh, this path says you can always do 1,200, but we honestly cannot flow more than 1,000 without having reliability problems. Yeah, we probably would take a look at TRM and not release that extra 200 because you can't flow it without causing a problem.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. And thank you, Kathy, for going through that example, because I think that is really helpful. I think that, to me, this is one of the more important topics, just because when we think about our transmission system and wanting to be able to achieve your goal, right, of least cost, security constrained delivery to or least cost delivery to to the ratepayers and customers. Opening up the transmission system, if you can help do that more optimally. But kind of differentiating which ones how you set up the CBM or the TRM, and whether it's systemic and you need to retain it, or if you can release it on that. I guess and this is always my principle that I try to remember. As long as you can curtail it if it's needed, then it can be released so that the system can be more optimally used. If you cannot curtail to manage yourself back into a reliable state, then it has to be retained. It's kind of how I think of it. I'm just curious if that jives with. Okay,
yeah,
cool.
that completely relates with me, at least, for sure. And so, yeah, that's how we've kind of looked at it as well. And everybody's systems are unique and different. I actually think at one time, and I don't know if anybody's changed it, at one time I think Idaho Power was one of the few even in the West that had CBM. Maybe others have since picked up and used it, but CBM tends to be kind of rare, at least in the Western interconnection. A lot of people just use TRM from the reliability perspective, but I agree. If you can, facilitate as much movement as you can and optimizing the system, that's just the best for everybody. Transmission is expensive to build.
Right. So I do see, looks like Steve Greenleaf has his hand raised. We'll go to him next.
Okay, sure. You'll hear a beep tone when your line is unmuted. At that time, please go ahead and ask your question. Your line has been unmuted.
Thank you, Christina. Steve Greenleaf with Brookfield, and thanks to the Idaho team. This is a great presentation. A couple quick questions, just on payment for transmission service. I know when you answered Jeff, you were talking about obviously you conduct a study and potentially it could come down to, you're going to need a network upgrade. But prior to getting to that point, you also consider redispatch, I'm assuming. And maybe if you could just talk about the role of redispatch in evaluating transmission service requests and how that applies kind of up the chain, non-firm, short-term firm, long-term firm, and network service, and how those costs are kind of assessed and billed. If that question made sense, I hope it did.
Yeah, this is Trevor. I think the redispatch option is something customers can request in the point-to-point transmission service realm. I'm not sure that really the redispatch applies to network service, but that'd be something we'd only study if a customer requested it. Kathy, anything to add, or did I?
Yeah,
was I off base?
Yeah, it's generally, we see that in the point-to-point long-term world where a customer can request that service. That's kind of about as far as I know. If a customer, if that is something that can be offered, does come with a cost, and that customer, that is procuring that point-to-point reservation is going to incur the cost of the redispatch.
Okay, and just from a kind of like a rate certainty perspective, is that kind of calculated in advance on an estimated basis, or do they actually incur on a month-to-month basis? Say they do a long-term firm point-to-point, or do they pay actual redispatch costs on a monthly basis?
So I'm going to caveat with saying that we don't have anyone that has asked or it's not been offered. We don't have any generators that have also provided that they would provide that service that could help somebody in an import capability situation like that. So I can't really answer the specifics of what it would. I would suspect it would be based on the actual cost of redispatch. But again, Steve, we don't have anyone that does it. We've never offered it. So I'm not really sure how it would work mechanically. Maybe in future presentations, someone can answer that one.
Yeah, no, actually, that's very helpful to know that you don't have that. And obviously, to me, translating over to the CAISO world, you know, which is kind of built around redispatch of sort, congestion management.
It's in our OAT. I mean, I will tell you it's in our OAT, but right, you have to have a generator specifically located that can redispatch, that can make it work. And generally, when you're talking Idaho Power, our import constraint tends to be the Path 14 or Idaho Northwest Path, and all of our generation is on the other side of it, on the wrong side of it, basically, right? So it's kind of like,
No, and that actually answers my second question, because I was trying to figure out how that works out. Because you mentioned you have very specific import constraints, which makes sense, but obviously you only control one end of the pipe there. So, okay, that makes perfect sense then. And then just real quickly, you mentioned, Kathy, that you calculate your TRM, I think, if I remember correctly, was driven by unscheduled flow needs. And I'm just wondering, it sounds like you guys kind of calculate or forecast those on your own. I was just wondering how it links up with the whole the whole WEC unscheduled flow procedures and mechanisms. I'm not that familiar with those, but I was just wondering, are you talking those are the same thing, or are they separate?
Yeah, so I you know, it's very similar, right? When the COI gets scheduled and flowing hot, so does Idaho Power's Path 14. I mean, those 230s and 500s system really load up quickly as well. And not all of it is quote unquote scheduled on our system. And so we use a historical look of flows and schedules to determine what that value looks like. But it's not tied directly, because right, the unscheduled flow procedures are based on if a qualified path gets loaded up, then they can start asking everybody else to curtail off. Ours is not a qualified path. That's the reason why we have to hold out firm capacity to accommodate the flows on other people's systems, because you know, electrons go where electrons want to go, unfortunately.
Yeah. Okay.
So we look at we pull historical flow values and schedule values to determine what that amount is that we have to hold from a reliability perspective.
Okay, thanks. That's very helpful. Thanks for answering those questions.
Thank you, Steve. Nice to hear your voice. I do see that Alan Meck has his hand raised, so go ahead, Alan. Just unmute yourself.
Hi, Alan Meck from San Diego Gas and Electric. So I'm having some trouble just doing like a basic linkage. Like, where does this presentation link up with how California and the rest of WEC ought to play? Because it seems like by what you've told us is that you've got multiple layers of reliability. Your transmission is never really constrained. Your resources aren't really fought over. And
yeah, I wouldn't go that far. I can tell you, and anybody that wants to like import and wheel through Idaho Power, it is constrained. Import capability is difficult to obtain. On a point-to-point basis, especially on a long-term basis. It just doesn't exist. Import into Idaho Power, just, you know, from the west side, just to give you an idea, it's 1,200 megawatts. That's it. And so that fills up really fast and hard, especially when you start taking off TRM and CBM to account for, loop flow issues. And so, no, Idaho Power is constrained. And I don't want anyone to think that from a west to east perspective, we're not, because anyone who tries to get transmission can attest to that.
Okay.
Yeah, there's limited import on our system.
Okay, so I guess my ultimate question is, can you try and help me understand where you see this presentation linking up with the broader question of how California ought to deal with its transmission issues?
Yeah. So I think, what we're just maybe pointing out is, we do have network and native load import needs at Idaho Power, right? We don't meet 100% of our needs all the time with the existing resources inside the balancing authority. And so we have established, policies and procedures and tariffs according to kind of FERC rules that allow us to utilize those tie points, those import places for native load and network customers while still selling transmission capacity as available to others under the open access tariff, because I still have that obligation, right? If it's available, I have the obligation to sell it. And so this was just more trying to point out kind of how do we determine really a fair and equitable way to do that, while holding for load that we need, but still allowing open access. And by doing that, we've talked about things like, well, we use their load and resource forecast. They not only tell us what their load expectations are, but they got to tell us what their resources are that's determining that. And if they really want to use that resource for that load, they've got to go designate that specific resource. And if it's off system, if they're taking title off system, they better have the firm transmission on the other side of the border to get it to us. So again, if it's a mid-C purchase, they better have firm transmission from mid-C to Idaho Power, or they don't get to use the firm network on our system that we're holding for them. So I think that's where it comes down, is because California's got, the issue of they import a lot of energy. They have RA contracts out there. Maybe the RA contracts have transmission to the border. Maybe they don't. I don't know. I'm not super familiar, with CAISO's world in that way. And so we were just trying to point out kind of how we do it with native load, network load obligations that we have in our balancing authority, and a constrained system where, it's constrained from a major market hub into our balancing authority. And so we do it all through that, through that calculations that we have here.
Okay, so we just have a few more minutes left, so I'll go ahead and go to Kathleen first, and then Chris, and then we can wrap it up. So Kathleen, go ahead.
Great, thanks. Yeah, this is Kathleen from Vistra. I actually just want to take Alan's question as an opportunity to make an offer from, one thing to say that I wanted to share is I do think that the OAT world is translatable to the CAISO world. We kind of mapped out high-level framework in our comments on the workshop that we had back in July. So if you go look under those comments that were submitted and look on Vistra's, you can see kind of just big picture. Here's an idea of how it could be translated into the CAISO's market design. But I'm really looking forward to these workshops, going through and hearing the different entities in the WEC, how they've implemented these OAT principles, and then coming together hopefully as a group and talking about in more detail how do we translate that. If you'd like to have a conversation with me, I think it's something I know, Milos, I've heard you make a pitch for. Let's talk outside of these working groups as well. So my information, I believe, is out there, and I'm happy to talk with anyone. And so, Alan, if you want to have a brainstorm session, just give me a call and we can do that. And I can kind of explain some of our comments and our thoughts.
Great, thanks, Kathleen. And let's go to Chris, and then we'll wrap it up.
Okay, I'm unmuting your line. Please go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, thanks. It's Chris Evan, Customized Energy Solutions. I had a similar thought to Kathleen when I heard Alan's question and the helpful response I think that Kathy gave. You know, I just wanted to add in here that it seems to me that there's some good concepts from this presentation that could be applied in the development of something, you know, more akin to the OAT world, and it can translate. I think I agree with Kathleen's take on it, so I won't belabor the point, but I would just say a little bit more specifically, it seems like you could take the internal California LSCs and allow them to use something more like a network service, and then have CAISO setting the native load calculation based on their forecast kind of in the longer term sense. And I think Milos, you know, did get at some of those kind of concepts about setting the native load calculation that might be transferable over to CAISO approach potentially. And then at the end, you know, you make sure that those California LSCs have designated network resources. Could be something similar like to RA resources or something along those lines in California, and be able to, you know, use the NITS calculation and the native load calculation in a similar manner to the OAT world, where you end up releasing some of that native load, hold back at some certain point. So that was kind of my takeaway from this, which I thought was a very helpful presentation by Idaho. So thanks for that, and I'll just end with that, but just a thought to consider kind of in response to that question by Alan and some of the concepts that are being presented here. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Chris. I don't see anybody else in the queue. Do we have any phone questions come in?
I do not see any phone questions either.
Okay, so let me go ahead and turn it back over to Milos to kind of wrap it up.
All right.
Milos.
Well, again, great discussion, and really appreciate the discussion from the Idaho Power team. I'll note, you know, great last question and great last few parting thoughts. This working group in particular is focused on the derivation of native load needs and how different inputs are utilized to ultimately arrive at those native load needs. We'll have a couple of other working groups, as I alluded to earlier, that are in process of being scheduled, looking at, well, what transmission products then does it make sense for the ISO to consider in allowing to reserve transmission after considering native load needs. You know, is it, you know, it doesn't necessarily have to be the same thing as the OAT type of transmission product, and we need to consider the implications of the market and compatibility with the market of different transmission products. But I think there's a robust discussion that can be had on what type of transmission product does it make sense if we can account for those native load needs. And then the third working group will focus on the planning aspects of the process and how do you consider expanding the transmission system to meet additional needs to the extent other parties want the certainty and the higher scheduling priority when wheeling across the ISO system. And for that effect, any other entities that want the certainty and are willing to pay for certain transmission upgrades, how do they get that certainty? And what's that process for expanding the transmission system in response to those requests? So there'll be robust discussions here over the next month and a half or so, and we're again in the process of aligning the different schedules and timelines, and you should be seeing the other two working groups scheduled later this week. But we really appreciate Idaho's presentation and all the discussion. If you have any questions offline, please reach out to us. If any of you are interested, based on some of these upcoming discussions, in presenting and sharing your perspectives or proposals, let us know. We can schedule you for additional dates. And Christina will be reaching out to the core working group participants to identify via doodle poll some of the next dates in December for this working group, and we should be scheduling those fairly soon as well. But all this information is posted on the initiative webpage, and if you have any questions after these meetings, please feel free to reach out to us. Feel free to organize offline as well and discuss some of these concepts and bring them back to the working group. Really appreciate all of you taking the time and the Idaho team, and we'll talk to you again on the 19th when the next working group is scheduled. We know that I think an hour overlaps potentially with the MSC meeting that's scheduled, and I think we're working through that just to see what we may be able to do, either to maybe move the working group to another date, or maybe the MSC moves by an hour or so. But we'll let you know once we figure that out. But the next meeting is on the 19th, and thanks everybody for taking the time. Christina, I'll turn it over to you to close it out.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you again to Idaho. We really appreciate the information today. Like Milos said, we will, all the materials related to this initiative are on the initiative webpage. We did record the session today, and we'll post the video file once we receive it from the vendor. And also, I will be reaching out to working group members to and send you a doodle poll to get dates for the remaining meetings for this working group. So thank you again for joining us. Greatly appreciate it, and enjoy the rest of your day.